In the heart of the medieval alchemical laboratory, illuminated by the wavering light of a single candle, the adept stands before three crucibles arranged in triangular formation. Each vessel contains prima materia at different stages of transformation, each fire beneath burning with distinct intensity and purpose. The alchemist understands what centuries of seekers have forgotten, that these three fires are not merely external flames heating base metals, but interior conflagrations that burn within the very substance of human consciousness itself. They represent the threefold ordeal through which the soul must pass to forge what the ancients called the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, that mysterious catalyst of total transformation which exists not in any laboratory but in the crucible of awakened awareness. The medieval alchemists, in their deliberate obscuration of truth behind layers of symbolic language, spoke endlessly of fire. But they distinguished carefully between fires, naming them with precision that betrayed their psychological sophistication. There was the fire of the furnace, the fire of digestion, the fire of sublimation. Carl Jung, excavating these texts in the 20th century, recognized immediately that these were not instructions for metallurgical processes, but maps of psychological metamorphosis. The fires represented intensities of consciousness, modes of attention, qualities of awareness that could catalyze the transformation of the psyche from its raw, unintegrated state into the unified totality the alchemists called the gold that does not rust, the medicine that cures all disease, the stone that transmutes everything it touches. The doctrine central to alchemical psychology is this: consciousness itself is the transformative agent, but consciousness must be properly tempered, properly intensified, properly directed. Raw awareness is insufficient. The psyche in its natural state remains fragmented, contradictory, at war with itself. The three sacred fires represent three distinct modalities of psychological work, three intensities of attention, three ways in which consciousness can be brought to bear upon the raw material of the self to effect genuine transformation. These are not sequential stages to be completed and left behind, but ongoing operations that the individuating person must learn to maintain simultaneously, balancing their intensities like an alchemist tending multiple fires of different temperatures. The first fire is the fire of the confession, what the alchemists called the fire of purification. This is the gentlest of the three flames, yet perhaps the most difficult to sustain. It is the fire of radical honesty, the willingness to see oneself without the protective distortions of ego defense. Jung understood that transformation begins with the withdrawal of projections, the acknowledgement of shadow, the admission of qualities and characteristics we have exiled from conscious identity. This fire burns through denial. It illuminates what we have kept hidden, even and especially from ourselves. The heat of this flame is humiliation, the burning sensation of recognizing oneself in the very qualities one despises in others. To tend this first fire requires what the alchemists called the spirit of Mercury, that quality of fluid awareness that can move between opposites without becoming rigid. It demands the capacity to observe oneself with neither harsh condemnation nor indulgent justification. The confessional fire burns steadily, consistently, requiring daily attention. It is the fire that burns when we catch ourselves lying, when we notice the manipulation in our generosity, when we recognize the cruelty in our righteousness. The alchemical texts speak of this as the washing of the leper, the cleansing of that which is considered unclean. Psychologically, this is the gradual acceptance and integration of shadow content, the recognition that what we despise in ourselves is not to be destroyed, but transformed through conscious acknowledgement. This fire produces its first material through dissolution. The rigid structures of ego identification begin to soften. The person who maintains this flame consistently discovers that the qualities they have denied begin to become available to consciousness not as enemies, but as energies that can be redirected. The rage that was repressed becomes available as passionate commitment. The selfishness that was condemned becomes healthy self-protection. The manipulation that was denied becomes conscious strategy. But this transformation does not occur through the fire alone. The confession must be genuine, which means it must be witnessed, if only by oneself. The alchemists performed their work in solitude, yet they kept detailed records, as if the writing itself served as witness. Jung insisted on the importance of active imagination, of giving voice to the contents of the unconscious. This is the work of the first fire, to bring into the light of awareness what has been kept in darkness, not to destroy it, but to see it clearly. The second fire burns hotter and with greater danger. This is the fire of the ordeal, what the alchemists called the fire of calcination. If the first fire softens and dissolves, the second fire hardens and tests. This is the fire of sustained difficulty, of chosen suffering, of deliberate confrontation with what terrifies. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the running toward the opposite, the voluntary embrace of what consciousness most wants to avoid. The alchemical texts describe this stage with images of violence, the dismemberment of the body, the separation of head from torso, the breaking upon the wheel. These are not poetic exaggerations, but precise descriptions of psychological experiences. The fire of ordeal is the heat generated by holding tension between irreconcilable opposites. It is the burning produced when consciousness refuses to collapse into either pole of a contradiction. The person who tends this fire learns to remain present with ambivalence, to sustain awareness in the midst of conflict, to resist the flight into premature resolution. This is perhaps the most demanding aspect of psychological work, because the psyche naturally seeks equilibrium through one-sided identification. We want to be either good or bad, strong or vulnerable, loving or separate. The fire of ordeal demands that we hold both, that we allow the tension between opposites to generate heat without allowing it to destroy us. In practical terms, this fire manifests as crisis, as the moment when established patterns of adaptation fail and the individual must either collapse into regression or break through to new integration. It is the fire that burns during depression when consciousness is forced to confront its own emptiness. It is the heat of anxiety when the future looms as pure uncertainty. It is the intensity of grief when loss strips away the illusions that sustained meaning. The alchemists knew that gold is purified by fire, that only sustained heat can separate the pure from the impure. Psychologically, this means that genuine transformation requires endurance of psychological pain, not its avoidance or premature resolution. But here the work becomes dangerous. The fire of ordeal can destroy as easily as it transforms. Jung warned repeatedly about inflation, about identification with archetypal energies, about psychotic breaks that occur when the ego is overwhelmed by unconscious contents. The alchemists understood this danger and encoded it in warnings about explosions, about poisonous fumes, about vessels that crack under excessive heat. To tend this fire safely requires what they called the hermetic seal, the capacity to contain the process within a bounded space. Psychologically, this means maintaining ego structure even while that structure is being challenged and transformed. It means having enough conscious stability to withstand the dissolution of identity without fragmenting into psychosis. This fire is sustained not through willpower alone, but through meaning. Viktor Frankl, surviving the concentration camps, discovered that those who endured were those who could find meaning in their suffering. The fire of ordeal burns most purely when it is voluntarily chosen in service of something beyond the ego. The religious traditions understood this, which is why they created monasteries, vision quests, initiatory ordeals. These were not arbitrary cruelties, but attempts to generate the psychological heat necessary for transformation. The modern individual, lacking these traditional containers, must create their own ordeals. The commitment to a difficult discipline, the choice to remain in a challenging relationship, the decision to confront rather than flee from what terrifies. The material produced by this second fire is what the alchemists called the philosophical sulfur, the fixed principle, that which remains after all that can burn has been burned away. Psychologically, this is the emergence of what Jung called the self, that center of personality which is distinct from ego, yet encompasses it. The person who has been refined by ordeal discovers resources of endurance and strength that were invisible before crisis. They find that they can sustain contradiction, hold ambivalence, remain present with uncertainty. This is not the fragile strength of defensive rigidity, but the supple resilience of integrated awareness. The third fire is the fire of the divine, what the alchemists called the fire of conjunction or the fire of love. This is the most mysterious and the most powerful of the three flames. If the first fire purifies and the second fire strengthens, the third fire unifies. This is the heat generated not by conflict, but by recognition, not by suffering, but by participation. It is the fire that burns when consciousness touches something beyond itself, yet recognizes itself in that other. The alchemical imagery becomes explicitly erotic at this stage. The marriage of sun and moon, the union of king and queen, the hermaphroditic figure that is both male and female. Jung understood these images as representations of the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that generates the philosopher's stone. This third fire operates through what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to generate symbols that reconcile irreconcilable opposites. It is not achieved through effort, but through receptivity, not through doing, but through allowing. The alchemists spoke of this as the grace of God, as divine intervention in the work. Psychologically, this points to the autonomy of the self, to the fact that the deepest transformation cannot be willed into existence, but must be allowed to emerge from depths beyond ego control. The person who has tended the first two fires faithfully discovers that at a certain point the work begins to work itself, that symbols arise unbidden in dreams and fantasies, that synchronicities proliferate, that meaning constellates without conscious intention. The fire of conjunction burns in moments of profound connection, whether to another person, to nature, to art, to the numinous dimension of existence itself. It is the heat felt in genuine dialogue, when two people truly meet beyond their masks. It is the intensity of aesthetic experience, when beauty shatters habitual perception. It is the burning of mystical encounter when consciousness touches the ground of being. The alchemists described this as the circulation of the light, as the rotation of elements, as the peacock's tail displaying all colors. These images capture the quality of this third fire. It is not the reduction to unity, but the integration of multiplicity, not the elimination of difference, but the recognition of pattern within diversity. To tend this fire requires what the alchemists called the philosophical gold, that quality of consciousness which is both receptive and active, both open and directed. It demands the capacity to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, to perceive the eternal in the temporal, to sense the whole in the fragment. This is not mystical inflation or spiritual bypassing, both of which are failures of the first two fires. It is rather the capacity to participate in larger patterns while remaining rooted in earthly existence. Jung called this the religious attitude, not meaning adherence to doctrine, but the careful attention to what moves in the depths, the reverential awareness of powers that transcend ego. The three fires must burn simultaneously, though their relative intensities shift with the phases of the work. The fire of confession must never be extinguished, lest shadow material accumulate and poison the process. The fire of ordeal must be sustained through periods of integration, lest the work remain merely conceptual without existential depth. The fire of conjunction must be tended even in darkness, maintaining faith that meaning exists even when it cannot be perceived. Together, these three fires generate the heat necessary to transform the prima materia of ordinary consciousness into the philosopher's stone of integrated awareness. But what exactly is this philosopher's stone that emerges from the work of the three fires? The alchemical texts describe it in paradoxical language. It is the stone that is not a stone, the medicine of metals, the tincture that transmutes everything it touches. Jung understood this as a symbol of the individuated self, of consciousness that has been refined to the point where it can transform everything it encounters. The philosopher's stone is not a thing to be possessed, but a quality of awareness, a mode of being in which consciousness has become its own transformative agent. The person in whom the stone has been forged demonstrates certain unmistakable characteristics. They possess what the alchemists called fixity, a quality of psychological stability that is not rigidity but centered flexibility. They have endured the fires and emerged neither brittle nor collapsed, but capable of sustained presence in difficulty. They manifest the union of opposites not as theoretical principle, but as lived reality, holding ambivalence without fragmentation, embracing paradox without confusion. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the capacity to be authors of their own lives rather than unconscious actors in scripts written by others. Such individuals often appear ordinary, even unremarkable. The stone does not produce superhuman powers or mystical abilities, despite the alchemical promises of immortality and omniscience. What it produces is something simultaneously more modest and more profound, the capacity to live consciously, to respond rather than react, to create rather than merely repeat. They have integrated enough shadow to no longer be driven by it, endured enough ordeal to trust their capacity for resilience, touched enough of the numinous to maintain faith in meaning. They are not perfect, for perfection was never the goal. They are whole, which means they contain and accept all of themselves, light and shadow integrated not through repression, but through awareness. The work of the three fires continues throughout life. The stone, once formed, must be maintained through ongoing practice. The fires must be tended daily, attention paid to the operations of consciousness, awareness sustained even and especially when it would be easier to fall back into unconsciousness. The alchemists spoke of the circulation of the work, of the repetition of operations, of the spiral path that returns to the same places but at different levels. Jung called this the circumambulation of the self, the gradual approach toward the center through repeated cycles of awareness. In the end, the philosopher's stone reveals itself to be consciousness itself, consciousness that has become aware of its own operations, consciousness that has learned to work upon itself, using itself as both substance and tool. The three sacred fires are not external forces, but modalities of attention, intensities of awareness, ways in which consciousness can be brought to bear upon the raw material of experience to generate meaning, integration, and transformation. The laboratory is not a physical space, but the interior landscape of the psyche. The work is not a historical process, but the ongoing present moment of lived awareness. The medieval alchemists knew what they were doing when they cloaked their teaching in obscure symbols and cryptic procedures. They understood that the stone cannot be given, but must be forged by each seeker in the furnace of their own becoming. They encoded their wisdom in images and metaphors, not to hide it, but to protect it from those who would try to possess it without doing the work. The three fires burn in every human psyche as potential, waiting to be kindled into full flame. The gold you seek, the medicine you need, the stone that transforms everything it touches, these do not exist in any external laboratory or distant teaching. They exist as latent possibilities within the very substance of your own awareness, waiting only for the three fires to be lit and tended with patience, courage, and unflinching honesty.